Welcome back, viewers and listeners. I'm here today for part two of an interview with Anna Yusim, Dr. Anna Yusim. And Anna Yusim is an internationally recognized award-winning, board-certified, Stanford and Yale-educated psychiatrist and executive coach with a private practice in New York City, Connecticut, California, and Florida. I'm going to leave out some parts of her bio, which we heard in part one, but I will say that she is the best-selling author of a book entitled Fulfilled: How the Science of Spirituality Can Help You Live a Happier, More Meaningful Life. And we'll be looking a little bit in more detail about that book in the process of finding out about her life. So welcome back, Dr. Yusim. So nice to see you again.
Thank you so much, Bob. It's a pleasure to be back here with you.
So in our first episode, we found out a little bit of your backstory. We found out about your origins in growing up in Russia and coming to the United States, and the religious freedom that was here, and how that gave you an opportunity when you were already on your academic path to explore spirituality. We heard a story about a psychic that you met who had an unbelievable amount of information about you from some unknown source. We found out about your travels around the world to explore spirituality, and just a little clue about how that made its way into your work, which now appears to be, if I may say, this intersection of healing and spirituality, which is really what our podcast is all about. Do I have that correct?
You do, absolutely.
Wonderful. Well, today what I thought we would do is to take a look at your book. I'm fascinated by the title. I have to admit, I have not yet read it, but I plan on ordering a copy of it. Tell us a little bit about what went into the book, if you would, and how you explored all of these topics and came to write the book.
Sure, Bob. So my book Fulfilled is divided into three sections. The first section is about the concept of authenticity. And authenticity is who we are separate from all the expectations, all the other voices in our head, who really we are at the deepest soul level. And all of us have a lot of impacts and influences on our lives, from our families, from our society, from our children, from our spouses, from our professions, a lot of expectations of who we should be. And it's often hard to distinguish those expectations from who we are at the core level, what we most deeply want. So the first section of the book is figuring out how to get at the root core of who you are and connect to your soul. And that entails many different things. That it entails looking at the ways that we are honest with ourselves and ways we might not be honest with ourselves. It entails exploring your shadow side, which is the part of oneself that we could disavow because we think it's unacceptable. So we can disavow our anger or our dependency needs, our so-called neediness that we can experience, things like that. And on the other side of that, we find this connection to the soul and a connection to our intuition, which I essentially believe is the voice of the soul. Intuition is that still, quiet voice that can only be heard when the other voices, like the voice of emotion and the voice of reason, temporarily quiet down. So that's the first section, authenticity. The second section of the book is about the concept of a soul correction. And a soul correction is what your soul has come into the world to correct, essentially. You could know your soul correction by asking yourself the question, what keeps coming up in your life again and again and again, often much to your chagrin and dismay, and despite your best efforts to change it. And the idea of a soul correction comes from this Kabbalistic idea or concept of tikkun, which essentially means correction. And for different people, the soul corrections are very different. So there's 4 soul corrections in particular that I explore in the book. And one of them is improving relationships, which has, a very vast a very vast array of topics within it. So some people need to be more dependent. Some people need to be more independent. Some people need to be more communicative. All of those are soul corrections. So improving relationships, harnessing one's personal power, transforming fear, and overcoming addictions. So those are the 4 soul corrections that we explore. And when I say addictions, by the way, just to be clear, I don't just mean addictions to drug and alcohol, which is what most people think. I talk about addictions to anything that takes away your power. So, for instance, there's so many psychological addictions that we as human beings have. Addictions to money, power, fame, intimacy, things like that, right? And all of those things are actually good in moderation. But you know that it's an addiction when the more of it you have, the emptier you feel. So that's the section on soul correction, which is the second section. And then the section on, there's the third section, connection to something greater than oneself. And that has 4 different chapters: consciousness, immortality, interconnectedness, and synchronicity. And so we go into the spiritual and scientific meaning of those 4 concepts as it pertains to fulfillment.
Wonderful. What a book. I love the topics. I love everything that you've had to say. I want to come back to a theme that we talked about in part 1, which was this dissonance between the idea, the materialist idea within psychiatry about what you are, the concept of mind versus the concept of soul. So how would you describe the difference between the idea of mind versus soul?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. And there's many different ways that somebody could answer that, right? So the mind, first of all, the question with the mind is, how is the mind different from the brain? A lot of people say that the mind is just one of many substrates of the brain. And that, in my profession of psychiatry, there's 2 primary modalities: psychopharmacology, which is medication, and psychotherapy, which, so psychopharmacology is for the brain, psychotherapy is for the mind, right? So the mind is a substrate of the brain that has all of the aspects that the mind entails. It has our struggles, it has our creativity, it has our ability to love. Some people can argue that that's all in the mind, and many people could say that the soul could be also manifest through the mind. And, for a lot of people, those 2 are synonymous. They don't even believe in the concept of a soul because the mind encompasses all the higher level processing that's an offshoot of the brain, but a little bit more ephemeral and dynamic and abstract than the brain itself, which is essentially an organ in our head, right? So now the soul has many different meanings and many ways that people think about it. And I gave you a definition by Fernando Broca, the shaman. But another way to think about the soul is that it's the transcendent part of the human experience. I love the quote by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, where he said that perhaps we're not just human beings having occasional spiritual experiences, perhaps we're spiritual beings having this temporary physical or human experience, right? That actually being a soul is our birthright, and that is who we are at the core level. And this human life is just one of many incarnations that we have, while the soul is transcendent. Some people, might say that the mind is transcendent. Some people might say creativity is transcendent. Some people will say that the mind exists in the brain, and others will say that the mind exists actually in the 0-point field, or something that's outside of us completely. And so these are a lot of interesting questions within philosophy, within psychiatry, within history, and the study of the mind. So I love that question. Thank you, Bob.
Well, to take it one step further, if we take the materialist position, we would look at this concept of mind as, to some extent, the tabula rasa concept, which is that we enter as this blank vessel. Now, of course, more recent scientific understandings tell us that there's a very strong genetic component to understanding who a human being is and how they start their life, and then the imprint that our experiences have on that. But that's still a long ways from a spiritual understanding of soul, where we come into this body and into this life with a very, very strong sense of who and what we are, what our destiny is, what our purpose is in life. So I'm curious about what the implications are in terms of how you do the work that you do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that one of the things that I help my clients and patients to do is to connect to their soul. And one way of seeing um, personal distress, psychological and psychiatric maladies is seeing them as a disconnection from one's soul, or seeing people as having spiritual emptiness or being disconnected from that part of the human experience. Now, that's not always the case. Psychological and psychiatric maladies happen for all sorts of reasons. We have a biopsychosocial model of psychiatry. So there's biological reasons why people can have psychological or psychiatric issues. There's social reasons that why people may have those issues. There's psychological reasons and there's spiritual reasons. And so the spiritual reasons are that people can have a deep sense of emptiness because they haven't connected to their soul. They don't know who they really are. They need to shed all the layers of their identity in order to get to the core and know what their purpose is, like you said, because knowing our purpose through the soul is our birthright. And that's something that sometimes people come in knowing, but sometimes there's so many overlays from society and so many messages of who you should be that you aren't able to get in touch with who you really are or who you really need to be or want to be.
Well, I absolutely agree, and we're certainly on the same page with that. Um, the other thing that it made me think of, especially given your experience, a lot of my training, as you know, is in Mesoamerican curanderismo. And in that work, we use Plática as step one. And one of my teachers was Elena Avila. Are you familiar with her by any chance? Well, at any rate, Elena, I had teachers both in Mexico and in the United States. And interestingly enough, Elena was a psychiatric nurse who became a curandera. She, like you, started out with a very materialist understanding. And even though she came from a Mexican household, she didn't really think of that as valuable. So she went through all the training, became a psychiatric nurse, and then turned back to the ways of her ancestry and her people, went back to Mexico, did, all kinds of work there in order to become a curandera. And she was really influential in my training in the sense that she brought some of the techniques of and the ideas of Western psychiatry into curanderismo. So whereas in Mexico, the tendency is for the plática to be fairly short, the heart-to-heart open talk tends to be short with more emphasis on limpia, the spiritual cleansing ceremony that comes after that and the treatments that come after that. For Elena, it was the reverse, and that was, one of the things that was most profound of her in my training, compared to some of my other teachers. And in Plática, so, typically in a session that I'm leading, the Plática may be 45 minutes and the ceremonial part of it may be 15 minutes. But what we're doing in the limpia part of the session is to take the symbols that we identified in the Plática and create an opportunity for ceremonial change, for something to shift in our understanding of meaning. And I'm wondering if any of that resonates with the nature of the work that you do, and also your travels in Mexico and other parts of Latin America studying with the people you studied with.
Absolutely, absolutely. On so many levels, it resonates. One of the parts is limpia, right? Cleaning out of, oftentimes, like we talked right before about temescals, right? A way of cleaning out and doing like essentially a physical and spiritual detox through a sweat lodge experience. Those are amazing. I've had several experiences like that. And also there's medicines like ayahuasca, where when you do that medicine, there's a shaman singing these beautiful icaros, they call. And one of the icaros is limpia. It's about clearing out your body, clearing out, the body, mind, body, and spirit. And oftentimes it's clearing out the old in order to be able to accept and understand and metabolize the new. And that comes from, with the concept of meaning that you mentioned. I think ultimately, we as human beings are all meaning makers. And the meaning that we ascribe to things changes over time based on our life experience. And we're also, narratologists, we're constant storytellers, and we're always upgrading our narratives. If we're committed to a life of growth and transformation, we're constantly looking at what narratives from our past are serving us and we want to keep, and what narratives no longer serve us, and that we need to change and upgrade. And this is part of the meaning making process. So I think in those two ways, through the limpia or cleaning process and the meaning making process, the work that I do is very aligned with what you just described.
Well, wonderful, Dr. Yusem. I have really enjoyed part 2 of our time together. We have another session coming up, and this is really exciting for our listeners because I want to find out a little bit more about the work that you do, but maybe even more importantly, ask you for some takeaways that our viewers and listeners might be able to use in their lives to make their life more meaningful in the way that we just described. So thank you so much for being here for part 2 of our podcast interview together.
Thank you, Bob. Wonderful.
And thank you, everyone, for listening and watching.